Are you a parent navigating the challenges of your child's learning journey? Are you wondering how to make education more accessible and engaging? If so, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Learning Disability Experts podcast, where we delve into valuable insights and strategies to support your child's different learning needs. I'm Jess, your guide on this journey. Welcome, everybody. Today, we have an exciting interview with Dr. Andrew Hill, who is a neurofeedback and biohacker. And I'm excited to have Dr. Hill share with us his company, which is Peak Brain Institute, and what neurofeedback is and all of that. So welcome, Dr. Hill.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate being here.
So, Andrew, tell us, what led you to the journey of neuroscience?
So I guess growing up, I was always one of those kids that had to take things apart, and had to figure out how things worked. And ultimately, the brain became sort of the most mysterious thing that I came across. But I got sort of object lessons in that. Growing up, my younger brother had a head injury. He was in a coma for a few months, and he came out of it, and he recovered most function over time. But seeing the really dramatic change in consciousness from a little tiny injury, and seeing how his brain was able to sort of develop, new abilities and relearn things over a few months when he was younger was pretty impressive. So I sort of it started me thinking about this mysterious thing that we have inside our skulls, and we didn't know much about then, and we still don't know an awful lot about it in many ways. So as I got into, years later into neurofeedback, I did that from working in other areas of health and human services. So I've done a lot of work in really acute environments, inpatient environments for folks who have severe mental illness and psychosis, folks that have substance abuse with mental illness, dual diagnosis units, they're called. I worked in geriatric units that were mental health focused. I worked in children, latency age units that were locked facility for violent psychiatric kids. And then I worked in group homes with adults with multiple disabilities for many years. And across all this landscape, human service sort of job, moving from one thing to the next every few years, I didn't see a lot of improvement. I saw a lot of palliative care. I saw a lot of people who really cared working with these individuals, but I didn't see a lot of impact in people's suffering, be it anxiety or ADHD or substances or autism. I just didn't see huge changes. I saw, I spent 1 year when I was working in this group home, running a group home. I spent a year teaching a guy to use a fork. That was our big accomplishment that year, was he could use a fork. And, so going out into restaurants and things wasn't quite so, embarrassing for his caretaker because he was using a fork instead of just getting into all of his food, that was a big win. And then the next year they didn't keep his education going, and he devolved back to not using a fork again.
Wow.
So seeing really severe suffering, developmental issues, injuries, psychiatric problems, really, was kind of frustrating. And I actually got injured working in a psychiatric hospital and couldn't keep doing the hands-on sort of semi-violent work that I was exposed to. And so I left human services for a few years and went into technology and did high-tech database work and some other stuff. This is around just before the 2000 tech bubble corrected. And then when that happened, I sort of said, well, let me go back into human services. I miss working with people. I have a lot of experience with kids and developmental issues. Oh, there's this place nearby that does this thing called neurofeedback I'd heard about. That's kind of exciting. I wonder if they'll let me do an internship and did some observation. And I walked in thinking I would have a part-time, short-term kind of observation job. And I walked out with a job, an actual job, because I had so much experience with autism and other developmental issues. And that was their big need. And I worked there for a few years, a place in Providence, Rhode Island called the Neurodevelopment Center. And within a few weeks of working there, it was really shifting my perspective on what was possible. So this tool that I'm happy to unpack called neurofeedback actually changes the brain, and it changes it relatively quickly, at least compared to most of the other interventions I had seen, medication, psychotherapy, structured behavioral interventions, et cetera. Those can make change, but it's kind of slow. And you also have to take into account developmental time courses and things for both children and elders. There's a long-term perspective on change for a lot of these areas of suffering. And yet in the center I was working in, I was seeing ADHD drop away in a couple of months. I was seeing eye contact recover in autism. I was seeing verbal prosody, that lilt. Sometimes autistic folks who are more impaired won't be able to monitor the tone of voice they make, so they talk like this. It's the lack of monitoring your own prosody or the lilt of your speech. I was seeing that return. I was seeing seizures go away. I was seeing obsessions go away in weeks. And it was just shocking to me because I didn't think it was possible. We do a lot of, in the field of neurofeedback, we do a lot of executive function assessments, CPT, go, no go style assessments, which is a pretty good way of picking up the ADHD landscape of things. Doesn't diagnose ADHD because you could have impulsivity from anxiety, or you could have inattentiveness from a sleep issue or concussion, but you can see the behavioral component of these executive function things. And now I still do this, but back then we would assess people with what's called a brain map or a quantitative EEG and a performance test that measures these executive function resources. And pretty much without fail, your first retest, which is usually in the second month, you've done 20 or 25 sessions of neurofeedback about 3 times a week. Pretty much without fail, in executive function complaints, you can get more than a standard deviation of change against the average population in that kind of time frame in like 6 or 8 weeks. And I started to see this with the first batch of clients I was working with and going, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This isn't what I thought was possible for ADHD or anxiety or seizure or autism. What's going on? And at the time, this is, to date myself, this is 25 years ago or so. And at the time, the field was still pretty niche-y. I mean, it is now. There's only about 15,000 people in the world that do neurofeedback professionally. But back then, it was like a couple thousand. And this is before the modern internet. So we're all on the Usenet and which is like forums and mailing lists and things, arguing about with each other about how it works and what the best way to do it is and why my version is better than your version. And it was a really vitriolic little, corner of the technology landscape, a bunch of crabs and buckets climbing over each other, trying to, my way is the best. No, my way is the best. And yet all of these schools of thought were getting better effects than traditional psychotherapy, medication, and other interventions, dramatically better effects. So, and they weren't in agreement with each other. So I sort of decided we had a blind men and elephant situation going on. Everyone had a piece of something they were describing and they couldn't quite figure out the overarching. So I went back to grad school and went to UCLA and studied the brain, studied cognitive neuroscience, which is the field that looks at how essentially the brain is producing the mind, or aspects of the mind like learning and attention and things like that. So I dug deeper into the brain and got some formal education. And I did a bunch of research looking at placebo-controlled, double-blind manipulation of the brain using neurofeedback. And also get into this idea of laterality, the idea of assessing different systems in each hemisphere and how those hemispheres might interact and coordinate across different types of behavior. So while I was in grad school, I started to see the mechanism of neurofeedback. That was something that had never been demonstrated. One of the things my dissertation work did was it showed how the brain was noticing the process of neurofeedback.
If you could share what neurofeedback is, and also you keep talking about how quickly progress is seen. I'm really curious as to what that timeline looks like.
Sure. So the timeline, I'll reverse the answers.
Okay,
the timeline is quick. You feel neurofeedback in 3 to 5 sessions. I would say most people do. About one person out of 15 or 20 feels it the first time. About one person out of 15 or 20 kind of never feels it, but things start shifting anyways across their life, their sleep, their stress, their mood, their attention. So let me give you a specific example that involves, real circuits in the brain, real resources. We've got a circuit on the left, sort of between the crown and the ear, whose job it is to stabilize, to keep you in the mode you're in. So it keeps you focused when things are boring, it keeps you on task, even if you'd rather not be. It actually keeps you asleep as well at night. So it maintains you awake and focused when you're awake and asleep when you're asleep. And the circuit uses beta waves to do its job. Very similar circuit on the right knows if you're paying attention. It's supervising the attention. And that also uses beta waves to do its job. And these two circuits on the left and the right, these central circuits will kind of go more automatic using alpha waves or theta waves. Alpha is a neutral between the gears, and theta sort of takes the brakes off and lets things happen. So often on a brain map or a quantitative EEG, you can see one person's resting levels of these things being a little unusual and go, okay, a lot of alpha on the left, inattentiveness. It's hard to stabilize the mode we're in, and things start to drift when they get boring. And the one on the right, if we're not supervising the moment-to-moment executive, anything that's higher stimulus, good or bad, pulls our attention. Squirrel, and we look for that shiny object or the thing that's higher intensity than the boring stuff in front of us. So often, people who have difficulties with executive function, whether or not that's classic ADHD or something else that comes along with executive function complaints, often you want to exercise or want to improve the beta and reduce the theta or the alpha. So the way you do that, you might train the brain for half an hour, about 3 times a week, maybe 4 times a week. And you typically feel neurofeedback for the first time about 3 or 4 sessions in. And what you're actually doing is you put some wires on the head and put some ear clips on and set the software up to measure the left side, measure that beta Also measure the alpha.
Is your child struggling with school, feeling overwhelmed? Introducing 3D Learning Experts, your child's personal tutor. Our expert educators provide personalized, one-on-one support tailored specifically to teach to your child's learning style. We specialize in helping students with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and similar learning challenges. Our tutors are trained to provide effective strategies for reading, spelling, writing, and math. With our innovative virtual platform, your child can learn from the comfort of their own home. No more commuting or scheduling conflicts. Give your child the boost they need to succeed. Experience the difference with 3D Learning Experts.
Or the right side. And the computer simply watches your brain moment to moment as you make a variable amount of brain waves. And whenever the brain briefly shifts in the right direction for that workout, the computer sees that and starts to plot it with auditory and visual feedback. So the alpha goes down, the beta goes up, and a Pac-Man starts to move on the screen, or puzzle pieces start to fill in. And the brain goes, "Ooh, stuff. I like stuff. Stuff's cool." And then it happens to move in the wrong direction. The alpha comes back up, the beta dips, and the game slows down or stops. And the brain says, "Hey, I don't like no stuff. Where's my stuff?" And it happens to move in the right direction again, and the applause continues. The big trick is we're moving the goalposts. Every few seconds, we adjust the computer next to where the brain is. So you're only getting applauded for the movement that we want to reinforce or exercise that day. So it's operant conditioning on behavior, but the behavior is involuntary. You can't feel your brain waves. You can't really control them. So you're sort of being exercised. And people train the brain for about half an hour at a time. Usually about 3-4 sessions in the session or right afterwards, the brain says, oh, you want some beta? Here you go. And you get a larger surge of those beta waves, and you feel that. You sort of go, wait a minute, feeling calm and focused. This is weird. Maybe imagining it. No, there's something there, huh? And then it wears off. And the next day you're like, I might have noticed something. And if you do it again, it happens a little stronger. So you have this opportunity to like stretch a brain resource, look at the after effects on sleep, stress, mood, attention. Those are the obvious and easy things to change, the big gross features. And you get some change typically that you feel. I would say about 90-95% of people feel the session. It's kind of subtle, but it's not nothing. And you kind of can tell something's happening in the background. And then your sleep is different that night. Better sleep, deeper sleep, lots of interesting dreams. Or maybe you train the brain the wrong way. Maybe you work out too hard or use a protocol that's not well suited to the person. Now you feel kind of wiped out in the session, kind of wired afterwards, and you can't fall asleep that night. And it wears off. So the next day you say, oh, I didn't like that. I felt kind of activated. Oh, really? Your brain did? Oh, okay, try this version. And typically get a better effect. So it's very iterative. It's not medicine where there's like a discrete intervention for a particular diagnosis. It's more like, okay, here's your brain, here's your resources, here's your executive function on testing, on assessment data. What's important? What do you want to work on? And the reliable stuff you can see on a brain map, on a quantitative EEG, are these regulatory features that all of us have, but they tend to, the regulatory features want to sort of adjust as you go to meet the demands of the world and cognitive challenges and stress challenges and things like that. And I consider the regulatory stuff about 8 things. All of the features of executive function or control over attention fit into that category. It's meant to change. If you're in a high, paced sports game or a car crash, the way you use your executive function is very, very different than if you're sitting weeding your garden. But they're both executive function, control over the progressive behavior that's, trying to get to some outcome. So executive function is really obvious in these big gross circuits. You can also see things like speed of processing, how fast the mind works. A lot of our kids with LD difficulties will have a processing speed, internal language issue. And some of that, not for everyone, but sometimes is a pretty big drag in language access simply because the brain isn't handing off language between parts of the brain that well. Whenever it briefly shifts in the right direction and the person doesn't read as fast or absorb what they're reading as rapidly or doesn't retrieve information as rapidly. And if you have an LD kid who's got that kind of slow processing speed, it used to be called slow cognitive tempo. It's really just the alpha, the idle of the machine is kind of draggy. That can be developmental. It can also be because somebody is dysregulated in sleep. It can be because of concussions. And anyone who's in their mid-years, if you're noticing increased difficulty, tip of the tongue, word finding, hunting for names, that's the same thing. Happens to us in our mid-years as we have crappy sleep and the brain slows down a little bit, we can notice speed of processing hitches. Now, these aren't things you should worry about or tolerate. You can change them, but it's a natural process. So if you're having that happen as a parent, well, now you know what your kid feels like when they're trying to read and the information isn't quite getting in reliably. It feels sticky and slippery and not quite accessible. That's the alpha speed. Other regulatory things that are probably relevant here include sensory processing, social processing. You can see that in the brain. And then stability. The brain is trying to maintain stability against seizures, against migraines, and that kind of stuff. So you can see a lot of these gross features in resting brainwave patterns. So like the ADHD brain has a high amount of theta compared to beta, lots of disinhibition. And for a while in the late 80s and 90s, we were actually using brain mapping, quantitative EEG, to almost diagnose ADHD. There's some studies by Dr. Vince Monastra in the late 90s showing that you can blindly sort thousands of cases of kids into ADHD and non-ADHD buckets with about a 94% accuracy rate simply on the ratio of theta brainwaves, disinhibition, to beta brainwaves, activation. Now, that research was really compelling. And over the next several years, I kept seeing conferences every year. I'd go to conferences and some grad student would replicate Dr. Monastra's research. Every year, the strength of the findings kept getting weaker and weaker. What's going on? Couldn't really figure it out. Was it flawed research? Probably not, because we're still seeing the same thing, but no one could quite get the same robust level of specificity that Dr. Monastra did. And then somebody did an analysis of the populations they had used for the research and looked at sleep. And they realized the reason we couldn't distinguish ADHD in the EEG anymore was because the population of adolescents that had been used, the cohorts that had been used, were getting progressively more sleep deprived over that decade. So sleep deprivation in a kid brain looks like ADHD. And I'm sure all of you parents who have kids who don't sleep well know that. When they don't sleep well, they get more scattered, more emotional, less executively, self-controlled. So you can see sleep issues. You can see if someone's got a dysomnia. You don't know what it is, but they're not managing energy really well. So executive function, anxiety, sleep, sensory social speed, there's a handful of other things you can kind of see at a high level. And if you combine that, the brain mapping assessment, with actual performance, a continuous performance task, a go, no go style task, which is really common for looking at executive resources, those two things together can kind of outline brain resources. And so a lot of psychologists and doctors will use this as a tool set as part of an assessment, landscape to go build your IEP or to write out your neuropsych report or something. And while I do some of that for people, mostly what I do is I sit down with your data and teach you how your brain works. It's not about getting to the right diagnosis. It's about finding the things you already know about in your executive function, stress, and sensory issues, and whatever else it is. And once I show somebody, I've had this happen so many times, again and again and again, every week. I show someone their brain, and they're like, oh, yes, it's real. I'm not just imagining my anxiety, my sleep issue, my distractibility. It's right there. I see it. And so the moment you see your physiology in data, and I'm explaining, hey, this brain pattern often means that you're anxious or you're distractible, and we see on your performance test that you're distractible or something. Once I start teaching the person about where that resource is that they kind of already know about, it changes their perspective on their suffering. If you understand yourself, you can be super frustrated at your broken shoulder on the x-ray, but you probably aren't ashamed of it or guilty or overwhelmed the same way. And yet we are, for our anxiety, our inattentiveness, our impulsivity, our rumination, we feel out of control of those things often. And like they're happening to us. And they're often given a label with all the stigma attached to whatever it is, having a different type of brain. But I'll tell you, I look at thousands and thousands of brains every year. People are weird. Good job. Be weird. The goal is not to be average. Looking at a brain map, which is compared to the average person your age to see what sticks out, the goal is not, why aren't you average? Let's make you average. It's like, okay, some things are sticking out. Does this matter to you? Are we seeing things you care about? And so often in executive function, anxiety, stress, fatigue, you can see these gross features. Or if there's a kid with significant LD issues, you'll see language tissue dysregulated. So when I work with kids, I also compare them to a database of other kids that have learning disabilities. And it's not, again, a diagnostically precise tool, but I can tell one person how unusual their brain is in left-sided language features compared to the average kid. Or often, like not just in people that come in with LD complaints, but often I find that someone has a little tiny hint of an auditory processing issue or a visual processing issue, and it's being called ADHD. And I look at their brain, I'm like, wow, your visual attention's amazing. You're super sharp, you're super self-controlled, actually way better than typical. And most of your auditory is too, but the alertness for new information in the auditory is horrible. It looks like you're having specific like timing lag onset for the auditory tissue. So, your psychologist sits there and says, do you have trouble paying attention? And you go, sorry, what? Oh, check mark ADHD. No, it's an auditory lag, and you can see it in the data. And often I'm working with adults as well. And I'll say, okay, so tell your partner, your wife, your husband, call your name, give you a beat of time, and then continue. And they'll feel way less ignored and you'll feel way less talked at, because all your brain needs for auditory is a half a second of orienting time to lock in. Or if I'm working with a kid, maybe their parents, and showing them this, that one little feature, the auditory lag, suddenly gives the parents a perspective on what they already know and gives them advocacy, sort of ammunition to go to the school and say, look, we need the IEP modified. Our kid needs lectures recorded, instructions written down, because this is auditory lag and attention that's in the way. So you can really get into the place where you're looking at your resources and starting to take a different kind of control over them, kind of like doing a blood test and then going, ooh, triglycerides, better back off in the Ben and Jerry's. And you can learn to take control of those resources without being in this, there's something wrong, here's the label, let me fix you. It's more like going to a high-end gym and doing lots of cool analyses and then going, oh yeah, I do want denser bones and better muscles and I do have some pain there. That's yeah, that. And so we're trying to really provide agency through the brain mapping and performance testing. And then we do this thing called neurofeedback. Most of our clients work from home in neurofeedback, which is a little unusual. We've got a half a dozen offices throughout the world, including LA, Orange County, St. Louis, Manhattan, London, and Stockholm. But I would say only about 20% of our clients visit offices. And most of them, we send the equipment out, and the coaches, I'm also a coach in the company, the coaches work with you live and teach you to put a cap on your head and squirt it full of gel for the assessments, teach you to set up some ear clips and put a wire or two in the right place when you're training your brain. So we gradually teach people to do neurofeedback, to stick wires to their head, run a session, and then look at the after effects with some perspective on how do we adjust? Do we get the effect we're looking for? Do you want to, push the brain harder, back off? So it's very iterative personal training. And then mostly involuntary. You can't feel your brain waves. So what you're doing a lot of is the next day saying, ooh, I kind of liked that. I cleaned my house. I felt calm. I wasn't mad when my mother-in-law called. That was weird. So you have this like shift of regulatory resources and you start to notice it. And also, of course, asking people to monitor this stuff day to day, your sleep, your stress, your mood, your language, your anxiety, whatever it is. As you monitor it, you start to develop a different relationship with it. And you start to think about how to change it. So just the act of measuring something, it manages that thing per Peter Drucker in business context. And in this case, if you teach someone to like monitor their deep sleep and then start drawing their attention to the things they're doing the day before, that could be throwing it off or improving it, neurofeedback or otherwise, it creates this agency in people to start taking more and more control. So I do work with an awful lot of things that have diagnostic labels and people that have diagnoses, but I'm not here to be another expert to give you a label and fix you. I'm here to be an educator and a coach and a scientist and to teach you about yourself and about your regulatory resources so you can start becoming your own expert. Doctors are great, but they have to be right. You go to doctors for answers, not for random information. Scientists, you come to for questions, and coaches, you come to for techniques. So we iterate, we try, we teach, we explore, we do new assessments, and gradually help people move through making changes. Neurofeedback in a typically developed brain, even ADHD and seizures and trauma, suffering happens to humans. But even in those brains, you get about a standard deviation of change every other month on like attention testing or big features of anxiety or something. So a couple rounds of that, like 3 to 4 months, we'll typically take ADHD that's really severe, on a bell curve, it's 2 or 3 standard deviations off the mean, and it will move it up to above the mean in 4 months, 50 sessions or something, or 60 sessions, pretty reliably. Now, not every single person has that rate of change, but most do for things like ADHD. And there's other resources that are relatively tractable. Among the most tractable things we go after, aside from executive function, would be sleep. That's one of them. Anxiety features. You can see the anterior cingulate. A lot of kids that have LD will have anxiety features as well. Having ADHD and anxiety at the same time is pretty common. You're gifted and anxious. And a lot of times you'll have the cingulate. The front and back midline will be kind of cramped up as well. The one in the front helps hold things in your mind. The one in the back helps orient to the outside world. And when those are cramped up, we tend to develop tics and obsessiveness with the one in the front and rumination with the one in the back. You also see social and sensory stuff behind the right ear. So if someone's autistic and doesn't have good verbal prosody or isn't picking up social cues with face expressions, then behind the right ear will be unusual. It'll be kind of stuck and hard to take information in. So if you teach somebody how their brain works, I'm not trying to reinforce the diagnosis. Instead, I'm exploring things you probably already know. And it starts to shift this perspective on our suffering. And then as you report what's happening day to day and start to feel a little different, that creates more agency. It's very sneaky what we do. We thrust agency upon you by helping you transform and teaching you about it. Instead of becoming the guru, we're teaching you how to think about your stress, your fatigue, your seizure, your ADHD. And for things like ADHD, at least, there's good literature showing that the effects are long lasting. There's research showing 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, and 10 years for both kids and adolescents for ADHD. The seizure landscape is actually how neurofeedback was discovered. And a lot of folks with differently developed brains will have some seizure difficulties. They'll have some trouble resisting. All human brains are actually balanced on the edge of having a seizure. Life is the balance between chaos and order. Too much order is death. Too much chaos is, not working. And we balance, called the edge of criticality. Human brains are sort of about to have a seizure all the time and then resist it. Kind of like humans that are walking are about to fall down all the time and they somehow manage not to. And it's really easy for a human brain to have that threshold to resist the seizure drop a little bit and have a seizure breakthrough. Children happens all the time with a fever, febrile seizures. And that's not epilepsy. That's just changing the chemistry, electricity so much that a seizure is allowed to sneak through. And if you have a kid who's had one seizure or two seizures with illness when they were 5 and 6, it's probably not really a big deal if it never showed up again. It's probably just a febrile seizure. Other kids with especially autism, other more significant developmental atypicality, seizures come along with that often. And so you'll see a tendency for seizure. The field of neurofeedback was sort of established in the mid 60s because of a serendipitous, mistaken finding that neurofeedback reduces seizures dramatically. Ever since then, that's been one of the areas of research and impact that we've been exploring, quite a lot. And the literature on seizure suggests that the average, a metadata study across many, many studies, the average reduction was 50%. And 5% of people get complete control of seizures. I've never seen a result as poor as 50%. Not once. Not once. And here's a fun thing about neurofeedback. The worse things are, the faster they change. So if you have really severe anxiety, really severe seizures, really severe ADHD, see it more clearly in the brain maps, and B, you're actually going to get somewhere in a few weeks, often. Start to see those effects start to build up quickly. So personal training for brainwaves, but oddly involuntary.
That was a whole lot of information, and hopefully I can remember all the questions that came up in my mind while you were sharing. My first question is, if someone has lots of neurodiversities, can they work on them all at once, or do they have to focus on one at a time?
You don't have to focus on one at a time. You would often do more than one thing at a time, but we are sort of full of systems of resources. So in the gym, you wouldn't work out your bicep and your calf at the same time, but you would work out your bicep and your shoulder at the same time, potentially. So in neurofeedback, we often are balancing protocols, trying to work on executive function, energy and sleep, and then managing the stress. And those can cramp up in many different ways for different complaints, but you kind of have to always work on sleep, stress, and attention, whatever you're doing, because that's kind of the basic machine. If you go in and do a deadlift in the gym, you've just worked out everything. And sleep, stress, and attention almost always will flex a little bit when you do neurofeedback, classic neurofeedback. And then you get these after effects on sleep, stress, and attention, kind of like you can tell that you worked out. And so how your sleep, your mood, your focus, your stress response, how they shift a little bit the day after or the few hours after you did your neurofeedback, that actually tells you about how the neurofeedback was landing. So you kind of get this global, you're training the person and you're targeting certain goals, but you're also getting global effects. And then you can think about those first big three, sleep, stress, and attention, as very much a foundational set of resources. And as those stabilize.
Is your child struggling with school, feeling overwhelmed? Introducing 3D Learning Experts, your child's personal tutor. Our expert educators provide personalized, one-on-one support tailored specifically to teach to your child's learning style. We specialize in helping students with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and similar learning challenges. Our tutors are trained to provide effective strategies for reading, spelling, writing, and math. With our innovative virtual platform, your child can learn from the comfort of their own home. No more commuting or scheduling conflicts. Give your child the boost they need to succeed. Experience the difference with 3D Learning Experts.
Then you would want to do sort of like an order of operations thing where you bring other secondary goals that are a little more tricky in afterwards, like trauma. Developmental trauma, CPTSD, regular PTSD, it responds exceptionally well to neurofeedback. You can help somebody pull the teeth of major PTSD in a few weeks. Developmental trauma is a bit more complicated and longer, but you can have major impacts.
It's interesting because I never heard of CPS, I can't say it, but I never heard of it before yesterday. And then here you're talking about it today.
Yeah, CPTSD is just developmental trauma. It's just slow-moving PTSD. That's all it is.
Oh, okay. So then maybe that's not the same as what I just learned about yesterday, which was about childhood, like sexual abuse and PTSD. Is that?
Yeah, it is. It's in the same ballpark. CPTSD. Now, this is a psychological categorization. But you can think of axis 1 versus axis 2 difficulties. And axis 2 difficulties are what are called personality disorders, narcissism, OCPD, etc., borderline. Those are injuries of relational attachment because you weren't safe as you were developing attachment resources. Okay. that is where CPTSD is driven from. It's the amygdala, it's the periaqueductal gray, it's that posterior cingulate I mentioned. But if you develop in a safe environment and then experience trauma, you can see the brain cramping up against the trauma as a PTSD response. But if your life was very adversive and difficult as you developed, you don't see the little signatures in the cortex as a cramped up resource because that's how the world was. And you have to you can still go after those things, but some of them are subcortical, which you can't see on the surface of the brain. And some aren't the same kind of cramp as somebody who's an assault victim or a war fighter or something else. Those are much more visible and actually easier to change in the brain maps very quickly, a couple of months. I've done a lot of work with veterans, and you can really pull the teeth of classic major, PTSD in 6-7 weeks for some people, like really thoroughly ramp it down. Developmental trauma, CPTSD, comes from all kinds of adverse experiences as you're growing up. And sexual trauma definitely happens. It's a large, unfortunately, a large percentage of people experience abuse from adults. That creates it. But it's not so much the particular nature of the event, it's the relational stuff being abused. That is what's causing people are not developing secure attachment and safety around other people, basically. So then they have this different way of navigating those sticky and stressful and frustrating things as adults because their attachment system, their relational system with regards to other people is insecure, it's push-pull, it's avoidant, it isn't smooth and isn't the same as everyone else's. That's what CPTSD is. There's a really good book in the field of neurofeedback by an author named Seaburn Fisher. And Seaburn's book is Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma. And it's all about using it for PTSD and CPTSD. Seaburn there was a paper not too long, a couple of years ago, showing that one single session of neurofeedback on the back midline in 85% of people with dissociative PTSD, one single session changed the coupling of the back midline to the amygdala, just abolished it. So it got rid of that activated threat response, essentially. Most things in neurofeedback do not happen in one session. It's a gradual workout. But I use some of these techniques that I mentioned that Seaburn discovered. I use it for different people, different goals. It's a very rapid experience. You sort of speed run your processing if you work out the back midline and can really develop much more stability and security with those relational things.
Do you meet for each of the sessions, or do you just meet occasionally and they do most of them on their own independently?
The latter. We do initial guided training.
Okay.
So I work with people initially going over all their brain data and teaching them how to think about data, and they teach me what's important in their data, basically. And then I build a workout plan, which has 6 or 10 styles of neurofeedback that should hit their goals. I'm not sure yet, but makes some sense. It seems plausible, often has worked. And then our coaches work with our clients to do live sessions for a couple of weeks. And we give every client a private chat, a Slack channel. It's always open, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So after the first couple of weeks, you know how to stick a wire to your head and get software running. You might not know what to do next, or if something happens, you might not be able to troubleshoot. So then we're right there on Slack every day, and someone can jump on and ask for help. We take over their computer, or they have a new question, we can answer it. And we also have you fill out surveys twice a day. So every morning, wondering how you're sleeping, end of every day, how are the other goals shifting, if they are? And so as the surveys come in, the coaches jump on your private chat and say, hey, thanks. Looks like we're on track. Let's do 2 more. Yay. And the person has this development or handheld kind of experience. Other times it's like, ooh, sorry, you're in a really rough place right now. Let's try something new. Let's try this. So we're both trying to help people make change they notice moving towards goals, as well as sort of responding to the day-to-day complaints about suffering and stress. I mean, if you walked into the high-end gym with your clipboard full of complicated workouts and you had a really rough couple of days, the coach might look at you and say, steam room, sauna. It wouldn't make you work out super hard if you're rough. And we do that too. We're, palliative today, or boosting today, or calming today. So the coaches are always online, and we're always right there 7 days a week.
Great.
So.
And does insurance cover this type of service?
Not real well is a short answer. But, we end up being like, I'll give you some pricing in our 2-month program. It's about $5,000 or so for 2 months. And in that time, you do 30 sessions of neurofeedback and 2 brain maps. And if you went longer, our prices drop to half when you extend. So it ends up being about $100 a session out of pocket when you work with Peak Brain.
So at $5,000 for just a couple of months, and I guess for the more life-changing results, you're talking like $7,500.
Right. Yeah. So it's for our plan list price, and all your listeners get $250 off, by the way. You guys can have a little break. And the $250 off comes off of either a full package or just brain mapping. Our brain mapping memberships, which this is really disruptive in the field. Brain maps in the field run between $500 in the low end up to about $2,500 for a single assessment. Peak Brain charges $500 once a year for unlimited assessments in the offices, and your listeners get that for half price. Most ADHD brains have a problem stabilizing sleep spindles. There's this thing called sigma, or a sleep spindle. It's supposed to fire when you hear a sound in the world when you're asleep to keep you asleep. If you've ever seen a cat on a windowsill watching birds, that liquid body is completely still and laser-like focus. That's the same state, sensory motor rhythm. When you're awake, SMR is used to sit still and calm down and stay on task. When you're asleep, it prevents you from waking up. It's also used to prevent seizures, to like pump the brakes. The brain doesn't take off into a seizure. Point being, the cat on the windowsill, the calm, focused cat, is literally the opposite of ADHD. Literally. So if you train up SMR, train up sleep spindles in humans that have ADHD, you eliminate the ADHD and you optimize their sleep almost every time. There's some research by Martin Arns, ARNS, in Holland, showing that, at least in some classic cases, ADHD is a failure of the brain to stabilize this brainwave. And when it's asleep, we call it a sleep spindle, or sigma. Almost every single person, it's very rare. I mean, 1 out of 1,000 who has ADHD doesn't have some sleep dysregulation. So
well, I must be one of those 1 in 1,000, because I've definitely got ADHD, but up until hitting menopause, I never had any problem sleeping.
Menopause will do it.
Yeah, it's done.
Menopause will do it. I have tons of middle-aged women right now who've gotten their first ADHD diagnosis at age like 47.
Oh no, I've been ADHD since I was a little kid.
But if you were just barely subacute as a woman, it would get missed because we don't pay the same attention to behavior.
No, I didn't get missed. I mean, I'm telling you.
Right.
ADHD, I wasn't diagnosed with it officially, but I mean, I remember in 5th grade running from my locker to my desk, singing, screaming, I mean, most
disinhibited.
Like
yeah.
Most
motoric.
girls do not behave like that.
Right.
Did.
Yep. And that was SMR, a failure to make lots of SMR. So it was harder to sit still. So you were looking for stimulus, and this is germane to folks that have kids with some executive function disability. Let me give you a really useful bit of information. The ADHD brain, under high stimulus and high intensity, is able to shut off the theta and bring up the low beta, no problem, and hyperfocus and go into flow states. Better than the average brain, actually. But under low intensity, there's almost no ability to do that voluntarily. What this means is your kid will seek high stimulus things. We know this if we have ADHD kids, but here's something you might not have figured out. It'll also train your kid to yell at you. Sorry, train your kid to be yelled, so you yell at them, take the trash out, or clean their room, because they'd rather have the conflict creating the higher intensity.
Oh, wow.
Than the boredom of sitting there. Yeah, I'll get to the trash, Mom. Watching TV. Oh, yeah, I'll get to it, because it's a change of valence, change of intensity to go down. It's very painful in some ways. So they'd rather be, come on, yell at you. Okay. The intensity comes up, and they'll train you to do that, to yell at them, because it creates this engagement of attention, and they might not even be aware of it. But all the time, parents are like, I don't know why I yell at my kid so much. He's so frustrating. It's this like little thing I've gotten into. Well, yeah, he's probably reinforcing it in you, because that engagement is intense, like a video game or a sporting match. It's
Uh-huh.
not positive, appetitive engagement, but it's high valence over low valence.
That's
And the
interesting.
ADHD brain is really wonderful at directing resources in response to the outside world and really poor at driving on the road by itself, staying internally directed. So actionable stuff for the parents listening. If you notice your kid is poking the box, maybe that's why.
Is your child struggling with school, feeling overwhelmed? Introducing 3D Learning Experts, your child's personal tutor. Our expert educators provide personalized, one-on-one support tailored specifically to teach to your child's learning style. We specialize in helping students with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and similar learning challenges. Our tutors are trained to provide effective strategies for reading, spelling, writing, and math. With our innovative virtual platform, your child can learn from the comfort of their own home. No more commuting or scheduling conflicts. Give your child the boost they need to succeed. Experience the difference with 3D Learning Experts. That's interesting. Yeah, because I homeschooled my youngest two kids for the last 10, 11 years of their career. And my second youngest, when asked, what do you like least about homeschooling? What answer was, I hated my brother and my mother fighting all the time. And so that was our, that was, I guess, the stimulant of getting my youngest son to do anything was me yelling at him.
Yep.
I mean, my daughter took a video of me chasing him around the kitchen once. That was a commonplace to get him to cooperate.
And you felt you had to, but he also probably reinforced that behavior.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And
probably didn't know why he reinforced it. He didn't like being yelled at emotionally, cognitively, but it was a more engaged mode than sitting quietly and trying to work.
Well, this has been an amazing interview. I appreciate all of your insight and expertise about the brain. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah. So folks, I've got some socials, of course. My own social medias are Andrew Hill, PhD. Peak Brain, my company is Peak Brain LA are the socials. But also check me out on YouTube, Dr. Hill, DRHILL. And every Monday night, I do a live stream where I am setting myself up, doing neurofeedback, answering random biohacking questions. So you can come check me out on Monday if you want. And, eyeball it in real time and get into it with very, very low risk.
What time did you say that?
6 p.m. Mondays Pacific.
6 p.m. Pacific,
every Monday.
so that's 9 p.m. Eastern.
Yep, 9 p.m. Eastern. It is saved on the YouTube channel. You can go back and watch old ones. But if you want to actually ask me questions in real time, come hang out. We call it neurofeedback and chill because we're like